Okay, hi everyone. So I can't believe we're in week 3 already. But I'm really excited to get into this week because we're looking at some more current non-traditional forms of poetry. Definitely, as our book tells us, some more experimental, and it's really cool to think about how poetry has kind of transcended over the years, to keep some of the basics from the beginning and kind of experiment and just be a little bit more open to different lines today, which is really cool. So I want to give you some brief, just go through our notes briefly here to give you some highlights from our books. And this should set you up really well for the rest of the readings this week, the conversation, and the writing that you're going to be doing. So with chapter 12 from this week, you can see right off the bat how it talks about this being experiment in the tradition. So like I said, it's the merging of sort of both of them together. If you were to, let me bring up my web screen for you here, look up experimental poetry, you're going to get a lot of different results from where sort of the origins of experimental poetry come from, all the way through sort of, different experimental poetry pieces today. One thing that I encourage you to do as we're going through experimental poetry is take a look. There's some really cool different forms of sort of experimental poetry playing on with word. That's one thing that's really cool to kind of think about. But basically, when you look at experimental poetry, and some of the TED Talks that we're going to look at this week very much emphasize this, it's awareness of using traditional forms, but taking that into your own particular aesthetic, taking that into your own range. So still having that very much, awareness and thinking about where poetry comes from. But there are specifically some literary magazines that are focused just on experimental poetry. So I've linked and created a whole bunch of different resources for you on our Canvas page. But I think it's just really interesting to kind of like keep your mind open to it and think about all the different forms that are out there. And that's why I'm really happy that our book definitely includes some of these. Now, I said this at the beginning, we're never going to get through every different type of poetry. We need a whole year class, much less not just a summer class. But at least this gives you some idea of the areas that you could possibly learn into a little bit more and give you a sense of maybe finding areas that you want to experiment and practice with a little bit more too. So when I think of experimental poetry, I think very much of images. I think of experimental poetry as sort of a collage of images together, and you can certainly correlate those. You probably remember putting together collages for some sort of school project in one form or shape. But a couple different ways that we define experimental poetry, and then of course experimental poetry has different sort of subsets to it, different types of experimental poetry. When you think about these key words, collage, montage, disjunction, fragmentation, nonlinear, different elements that combine modern with postmodern. That's definitely experimental. You have the cut up or the collage, which is a really interesting way of looking at poetry, and novelist and writer William Burroughs used this method quite a bit as well, amongst some others. So the cut up poem is a technique that would be very much appealing to the visual artist, but you can see why it might also appeal to writers just in general. Literally, the cut up technique allows you to not put together a totally linear perspective. It lets you form kind of those visions, those words in your mind, and then kind of put that to the page too. So that's really kind of an interesting piece. If you like music, if you really like lyrics, lyrics are a great way to sort of play with like cut up poetry and a cut up piece like that too. So quite literally, there's a lot of different exercises that you're going to read through in this chapter. Cut up poetry is if you were taking two different pages from different parts of a newspaper, if people still read newspapers, or magazines, or whatever it is that you want to kind of look at. You're circling phrases and groups of words that's, in the pages in front of you. You circle whatever might just pop out at you. The idea is not to spend too much time on it. You're glancing over the process and circling and moving on. And part of the whole process, as Cowett mentions, is to be uncensored and non-critical. So if you keep taking the time and being really careful about which words to pick out, you're not going to get that sense of that cut up kind of, spontaneity, that, playfulness, that putting together. And one of the exercises says when you circle 20 or 30 items, move on, do some more, and then see how many words that you have, put those together for different types of poems. So that's a really like freeing kind of exercise. However, you want to make sure still that, the idea of these experimental poetry subsects is not to have poetry that just is sort of like randomly plopped on the page. You still want to make sure that what you're using has meaning and emphasis, and that you're still putting together something that other people can read and something that in one shape or form will make sense. So that's one thing. So I think that's really a cool kind of exercise. If you want to do that one on your own, I would say probably if newspapers aren't around, pick up like a magazine, or pick up even a textbook if you really wanted to, whatever is kind of in front of you in that sort of way. So they offer some examples here of putting together the cut up pieces from newspapers and drafting that. And so here you can sort of see somebody's process and how they would go throughout the pages. I actually think this is a fun writing exercise to do no matter if you're writing poetry or prose writing. I think it takes you out of the box, and I think it gives you a little bit more, a little bit more feedback kind of, and a little bit break for your mind almost if you're having a hard time thinking of a prompt. Now, the other things that you can think about, coming along with experimental poetry. If you like music, which I'm sure many of you do, you concentrate a lot on the sounds, which is going to even lead us to thinking about some sound poetry in a little bit too. That's why it is so important when you are putting together your cut up piece to make sure that you are reading it out loud, to hear the emphasis and to kind of make sure that it makes sense too. The other types of poems that Cowett mentions in this chapter that we're going to be looking at as well are the cross-out and the white-out poem. So I'm sure you can, from the titles of these, see that a lot of these poems are sort of very self-explanatory. This is a type of cutout poem. One is called the ransom note. So this one is much more hands-on. You need scissors, glue, paper. I think you could have fun with this. This is a great activity to do even with kids or like younger siblings, or even just with your friend. I don't know, I have kind of fun doing it as well. And look how awesome you can see the form and function kind of comes. Another text generated poem is the crossout. You could do this again with a newspaper column. You could do it with any large chunks of writing here. So this is a sample below who's been using from a poet, Mark Melnikov. He's used this for a couple sort of his basis of a genre. But you can see crossing out and then just sort of having the phrases, kind of the words stand out to form that visual appeal, and goes all the way down with that. And another cool way of doing it is a whiteout poem. So the author erases with whiteout ink. Do you remember using those? Probably remember using those in high school before everything was typed. I always used to spill my bottle of whiteout. But here is sort of taking out some of the other lines, everything that is not in the poem, and putting it together too. So these are very cool. I love, if you're a visual learner, I think these are some really cool ways of putting together some pieces of different types of poetry like that. And again, Cowett offers some exercises, so I would totally encourage you to try these on your own, some of these a little bit more, because I think just having the hands-on approach is really, really fun. So, and to cover a little bit briefly, to go into language, the next chapter here as well, to kind of complement the experimental style. We have here, actually love sort of the start off from Gertrude Stein, from her stanzas in Meditation. She says, I have not come to mean, I mean, or if I not, I do not know, if not, I know or know, this which if they did go, not only now, but as much so, as if when they did which, if not when they did which they go, which if they go this as they go, they will go which they did know, not which if they do go, as much if they go. I do not think a change. I do think they will change. But will I change if I change? I can change. Yes, certainly if I can change. It is very foolish to go on, oh yes you are. How could one extricate oneself from where one is? One is to be, one is to extricate whichever. They cannot be for this any reason for an occasion, of which they are remarkable as a remembrance. No, that is not a Dr. Seuss lyrical poem or anything like that. That is from one of the modernist poets who's also included in your Oxford Book of American Poetry, Gertrude Stein. Now, I know this stanza sounds a bit lyrical and redundant and almost like a tongue twister when you read it, but I assure you it's a different experimental modernist form of poetry. And Cowart asks us the question, have you ever said a word over and over until it sort of loses all significance and becomes just sort of odd, and you don't, it just becomes more sounding than it does have meaning to that too. That's why kids love to play with language. That's why kids repeat language over and over again. That's why they ask you why 100 times over. And poets kind of do this, repetitive sense over and over again to invest themselves in a different type of medium. So not only are they looking at the words on the page, but these poets, these very much modernist poets that we're going to talk about in another set of notes here, become very much involved with color and paint and form and lines and relationships, so that they really want to give you that very visual collage, meshed together kind of approach. And that's sort of what Gertrude Stein here. She was really influenced by Cubanist experiments. So think painters like Pablo Picasso and how he would put together his series of images. All these continual permutations, these ways that you're looking at language and configuring it together, and the lyrical sense that kind of comes out about it. She didn't think her poems were abstract in the sense that they didn't refer to the material world outside the language, but you can see upon first glance they appear a little bit abstract to you at first, and they appear a little bit out of sorts. We're also going to be reading some E. E. Cummings for this week, and I love that his comment, Gertrude Stein subordinates the meaning of words to the beauty of the words themselves, words becoming autonomous objects rather than symbols of something else. So I think that's a fun way to kind of put that up there. Now, coming after this, there's a couple other different types of experimental poems that you can see. One is the concrete or the visual poem. So literally, what they call a concrete or conceptual program is very, very much used of graphics. So you can play with this in design classes, which is really fun. Almost like taking different shapes and putting and publishing that and pasting that up kind of together. What we'll also be talking about is the found poem. When you come across a passage in something that you're reading, letter, newspaper, even today maybe email, it doesn't have little or no editing, almost like a perfect poem together. That's sort of kind of like a found poem, and there's some examples here that put that together. An aleatory poem, the cut up, the cross out, the white out that we previously looked at, and the other elements. A lot of words and phrases that emerge from other sources. So here is sort of what we call like a non-intentional method or an aleatory poem. Here you kind of have the caps lock, you kind of have the sequence from that, and so you can really play. You use the sentence elements like a read-through style, like almost like that. When you see caps lock, you want to have that very big emphasis. You almost feel like someone's screaming to you. They probably are in that way. And of course, another fun type of poem is the sound poem, where when you read it to yourself, it looks fun and it's comical and it has like a fun flow to it. But when you read it out loud and see and hear the combinations together, it's not only just meant to be satire, but it's meant to give you visual and auditory pleasure. So it's meant to be visually appealing, which is really cool in the form, and then also sound really nice. And the other type is a translitic poem, and that literally means a poem translated from a foreign language, by paying attention not necessarily just to the meaning of the words, but to their sounds. So in my next set of notes, I'll pick up here and talk a little bit about these. Now, certainly you are not going to be writing in all these different experimental styles, but it is cool to kind of pick up and look and see the associations between each and every one of them. And of course, if you see these somewhere, where you can find them.